Welcome to Traoré Hero Channel. Subscribe now for more stories of Africa's courage, leadership, and hope. God bless Africa. Amen. On the morning of August 1st, 2025, a silence fell over Burkina Faso that was heavier than any gunfire. It did not begin with marching boots or a battle cry. It began with a sheet of paper signed in Washington. With the stroke of a pen, the United States imposed a 50% tariff on Burkina Faso's most precious export, shea butter. No warning, no negotiation, no explanation. For decades, shea butter had been more than a product. It was women's gold. It sustained more than 160,000 women across the Sahel. From the dusty villages of Kaya to the bustling markets of Bobo Dioulasso, women cracked nuts by hand, churned paste over fires, and pressed butter that traveled across the oceans. It ended up in beauty creams in New York, in luxury boutiques in Paris, and in lotions sold in grocery stores across Texas and Florida. To the world, it was an ingredient. To Burkina Faso, it was survival. In one instant, that lifeline was cut. Trucks sat idle in the sun. Cooperative warehouses locked their gates. Drivers slept in their cabs, waiting for calls that would never come. In villages, women looked down at their churned paste, uncertain whether it would bring food or waste. The White House offered only vague words: national interest, economic realignment. But to the people of Burkina Faso, it was clear. This was not regulation. It was not routine. It was a weapon. A weapon aimed not at products, but at people. And then one voice rose above the silence. President Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier turned statesman, addressed his nation. His words carried the weight of history and the promise of defiance. They tax our labor, our heritage, and the very hands that feed our women. They will not break us by starving our people. We will not outsource our justice. Sovereignty is not given. It is structured. This was more than a speech. It was a declaration. A young leader refusing to bow to silent chains. What followed was not collapse, but a pivot that asked a larger question. Could one small nation redraw the map of global trade? And could Africa itself reclaim the right to decide its destiny? This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. It is the story of sovereignty, dignity, and survival. It is a story that reaches from the red dust of West Africa to the boardrooms of Washington, Paris, and Beijing. And it is a story that asks each of us, if butter can bend empires, what happens when Africa's other treasures, cocoa, coffee, cotton, gold, are no longer sold as raw gifts, but as sovereign power? Stick with us, folks, because this isn't just about butter, or even about Burkina Faso. This moment is bigger than borders. We're here to uncover what happened, why it matters, and how this moment could redefine Africa's role and the role of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré on the world stage. It's about a continent rising together. Stand with us. Share this message. Let your city, your voice, your name be part of history. The tariff did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly, a decree signed in Washington, but its echo was loud in the streets of Ouagadougou and the villages of the Sahel. On that first day of August, phones inside Burkina Faso's ministries began to ring with panic. Procurement offices went dark. Export contracts froze overnight. For women whose daily rhythm was tied to the churn of shea paste, the silence was suffocating. For more than 2 decades, shea butter had been the quiet strength of Burkina Faso. Known as women's gold, it supported families, paid school fees, and financed small community projects. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. 160,000 women depended on it, not as wage laborers for distant corporations, but as the backbone of their homes. In the northern village of Bulsa, a woman named Amanatara sat cross-legged in the red dust. That morning, her hands had been thick with churned paste, the kind she had worked since she was a girl. But now she stared down at her work, uncertain if it would feed her children or be left to spoil. Around her, women whispered the same question. Was this the end of their livelihood? Was this the collapse of their survival? In Bobo Dioulasso, the country's main transport hub, the roads grew silent. Trucks loaded with barrels of unrefined butter sat unmoved under the blazing Sahel sun. Drivers, paid only when shipments reached their destination, slept inside their cabs. Some hadn't moved in days. One driver told a local reporter, "Every morning I wake up and ask, where do I go? And every morning, the answer is nowhere." Inside Ouagadougou's ministries, procurement officers sat helpless. Phones rang unanswered. Contracts that had once tied local cooperatives to buyers in Missouri, New York, and Miami dissolved overnight. The American buyers had disappeared, unwilling to risk the new tariff. For a country already landlocked and often struggling to find fair markets, the decree felt like a tightening noose. The White House offered no apology, no explanation, just a few lines about national interest and economic realignment. To Washington, it was paperwork. To the women in Kaya and Bulsa, it was punishment. President Ibrahim Traoré saw it clearly for what it was. Standing before his people, he spoke not with hesitation, but with fire. They tax our labor, our heritage, and the very hands that feed our women. This is not trade. This is economic warfare. His words spread like fire on dry grass. From ministries to markets, from the capital to remote villages, people repeated them. And as his words traveled, something remarkable happened. Fear began to turn into defiance. In Kaya, cooperative leaders gathered under neem trees to discuss their next steps. One of them, Salamata Konate, spoke softly but firmly. They think we are only exporters, but we are mothers. We are fighters. Her words lifted spirits. Women who had spent the day in tears lifted their heads. Men who drove idle lorries stood straighter. Children repeated the phrases they heard on the radio. Yet the economic pain was real. Within 48 hours of the decree, haulage volumes had collapsed by nearly a third. Export managers in Bobo Dioulasso scrambled to contact alternative buyers, but most phone calls ended in silence. Neighboring Ghana and Benin tried to step into the gap, but nothing could replace the richness of Burkina Faso's product, nor the dignity of the women who produced it. This was the test. Washington believed that a fragile nation, scarred by decades of colonial legacy, would fold under pressure, that its people, reliant on external markets, would surrender quietly. But in Ouagadougou, the young captain turned president had other plans. Traoré did not plead for reversal. He did not beg for compromise. He looked at the decree not as the end, but as the opening move of a larger game. For months, perhaps even years, he had anticipated the possibility of betrayal. He had studied the way nations rise or fall not only by armies, but by economics. And he had prepared. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could endure the blow. The question was how it would respond, and whether one of Africa's smallest nations could turn a weapon meant to break it into a tool of strength. What happens when a nation refuses to bow? The answer came within days, and it shook the balance of power far beyond the Sahel. By the second day, the silence of empty warehouses had become the sound of resistance. What had begun as fear was transforming into something older and stronger. a resolve rooted in memory. Burkina Faso had known hardship before. It had endured colonial rule, sanctions, drought, and debt. And each time, the people had learned to bend, but not to break. On August 2nd, President Ibrahim Traoré summoned agricultural unions, cooperative leaders, and trade ministers to the presidential compound in Ouagadougou. The air was heavy with Sahel heat, but the mood was heavier still. Around the table sat men and women whose communities were reeling from the tariff. Some expected anger, others expected despair. What they heard instead was calm, unyielding resolve. Traoré looked them in the eyes and declared, "They will not break us by starving our people." The words were simple, but in that moment, they carried the weight of centuries. Within hours, those words echoed across the country. Broadcasters repeated them every hour. Students painted them on walls. Shopkeepers wrote them on shutters. Women whispered them at wells and marketplaces. In a single day, his phrase became a national mantra. The emotional tide shifted. In Kaya, where cooperative leaders had gathered in the shade of neem trees, Salamata Konate spoke again to her members. Her voice carried not despair, but determination. "We are not only exporters, we are mothers. We are fighters." Across the Sahel, those words resonated like a heartbeat. And while the people of Burkina Faso found strength in defiance, the world was watching. In Nairobi, newspapers led with bold headlines. "Burkina Faso defies Washington." In Mumbai, television analysts debated whether the United States had overplayed its hand. In Dubai, trade experts asked whether this was the beginning of a larger rebellion in global markets. And in London, traders scrambled. The Shea Futures Index spiked by 11% in a single day, as investors rushed to hedge against a sudden collapse in supply. For decades, shea butter had been dismissed as a niche commodity, a small piece of the vast global trade puzzle. Yet now, a single tariff had turned it into the center of international debate. Back in Burkina Faso, the defiance grew louder. At Revolution Square, in Ouagadougou, thousands gathered in the evening heat. They carried banners, raised flags, and chanted the words of their president. Radio hosts interrupted programs to replay his speech. Drums echoed in the streets, and voices rose in unison. Our land, our right, our future. But this was not just about words. It was about survival. Families still faced uncertainty. Cooperatives remained idle. Markets still trembled. The people knew defiance alone could not fill plates or keep trucks moving. Something had to change. The turning point came on August 4th. Just 3 days after the decree, the counterpunch landed. Beijing's Ministry of Commerce announced that 128 Chinese companies had been granted licenses to import shea butter directly from Burkina Faso. The deal was unprecedented. It came with no quotas, no hidden debt, no vague promises of aid, only trade. More importantly, it carried conditions that reshaped the very structure of the industry. Shea butter would no longer leave the country raw. Processing facilities would be built on Burkina soil. Technology would be transferred. Royalties would flow directly to cooperatives. The announcement reverberated across the continent. In Lagos, exporters hesitated, realizing the rules of trade were shifting. In Accra, Ghana's Ministry of Agriculture began quietly studying whether cocoa could follow the same model. In Johannesburg, murals appeared overnight. Women lifting barrels of shea butter toward the rising sun, painted with the words, "From soil to sovereignty." For the people of Burkina Faso, the news spread like rainfall after drought. In the hills of Kenedougou, women danced outside their cooperatives. One of them, Ayo, adjusted her headscarf and said with quiet pride, "It means we work tomorrow, and maybe next year." The fear of collapse had turned into a vision of possibility, and the message was clear. Burkina Faso was not begging for survival. It was building a doctrine of sovereignty. If one landlocked nation can bend the balance of global trade with butter, what might happen when Africa's cocoa, cotton, or gold are treated the same way? The tariff had been meant to weaken. Instead, it exposed the backbone of a nation and forced it to stand taller. What happened after August 4th was not merely a trade adjustment, it was the birth of a doctrine. With the Chinese deal in place, Burkina Faso's economy began to pivot. The agreements were different from the old colonial contracts. They didn't just take resources away, they required something in return. Processing facilities would be built in Burkina Faso. Solar dryers and cold storage units would be installed. Technology transfers would become mandatory, and cooperatives would receive royalties for every exported unit. For the first time, women who had cracked nuts barefoot under the Sahel sun now scanned shipping manifests on digital tablets, logged invoices electronically, and even learned to negotiate in Mandarin. This was not charity. It was structure. It was sovereignty, written into contracts. By mid-August, the changes were visible. Logistics hubs in Koudougou and Banfora reduced transport delays by nearly 40%. Cold storage allowed cooperatives to preserve their butter for weeks instead of days, giving them leverage in negotiations. Payments that once arrived late, or not at all, were delivered within 72 hours. Mothers budgeting for food and school fees could finally trust the calendar. The cultural shift was just as profound as the economic one. Musicians in Ouagadougou released songs with refrains like "Shea is ours." Poets compared cracked shells to colonial scars, now mended through sovereignty. Street murals bloomed in markets, women lifting barrels of butter into a rising sun. Even the Ministry of Education introduced new modules on indigenous trade history. In one classroom, a 12-year-old girl was asked, "What does sovereignty smell like?" She answered, "It smells like the butter my grandmother makes." The shift was not limited to Burkina Faso. Across Africa, leaders began to take notice. In Accra, Ghana's Ministry of Agriculture launched a working group on cocoa verticalization. In Senegal, officials debated refining cashew oil at home. Ethiopia studied whether its coffee exports could follow the same model. The message was spreading. Afrique did not have to remain a supplier of raw goods. It could demand value. Politically, the transformation was no less striking. Where previous governments had approached Paris or Washington with pleas, Traoré's administration presented terms. A West African envoy in Addis Ababa summarized it simply: "We used to ask, now we negotiate." That change in posture sent ripples through diplomatic halls. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso was not being spoken for. It was speaking, but with opportunity came risk. Critics within Burkina Faso and abroad raised concerns about overdependence on Beijing. Was the nation replacing one master with another? Could Chinese investment become another chain, just gilded differently? Traoré answered those questions directly. "We will not outsource our justice." His government banned offshore arbitration for trade disputes, insisted on domestic courts, and required every contract to include enforceable rights for workers. The result was a rare balance: accepting partnership without surrendering sovereignty. For ordinary citizens, the change was tangible. Drivers who had once slept in idle trucks now carried loads eastward. Cooperatives that had feared closure now saw steady demand. Families who had braced for hunger found meals secure again. The tariff, intended to break Burkina Faso, had instead become a turning point. It reawakened civic spirit and gave people a new identity, not defined by silence or scarcity, but by dignity and direction. The nation was beginning to see itself not as a victim of global trade, but as an architect of it. One cooperative leader described the change with fierce simplicity. We are not laborers for someone else's profit. We are shareholders in our own destiny. The consequences were clear. What had begun as a sudden strike from Washington was turning into a long-term shift in Africa's economic posture. Burkina Faso had transformed butter into a banner, and the doctrine of sovereignty was no longer theory. It was daily life, written into contracts, enforced by policies, and carried in the pride of its people. But while Burkina Faso found its footing, the old powers were watching. The question was no longer whether it would survive, but how Washington and its allies would respond. In Washington, the silence that had once seemed strategic began to sound like defeat. The tariff had been designed as pressure, a test of strength, a demonstration that the United States still controlled the levers of global trade. But within weeks, it was clear the move had backfired. American cosmetic labs scrambled to reformulate creams. They turned to Guinean supplies, to synthetic substitutes, to anything they could find. But the formulas didn't feel the same. In Denver, one mid-tier beauty brand admitted in a leaked memo, "The formula feels off." Customers noticed. Online reviews were blunt. "This isn't real Shea. Something's wrong." Small businesses were hit the hardest. In Chicago, shop owner Clarissa Woodson stared at empty shelves. "3 months now, no Shea again," she whispered to a local radio host. In Miami, a skincare entrepreneur admitted she was taping shipping boxes by hand to save costs, as margins vanished and staff were let go. From Brooklyn to Los Angeles, boutique stores began to close their doors. For large corporations, it meant lost profits. For small entrepreneurs, it meant survival slipping through their fingers. A policy meant to hurt Burkina Faso had instead bled American small businesses and frustrated American consumers. In Europe, unease spread. For decades, Paris had assumed influence in West Africa was its natural inheritance. Now, French officials found themselves on the outside, bidding for access to a market they once controlled by default. In Brussels, trade representatives debated how to re-engage without appearing desperate. In Moscow, the response was quiet approval. Russian analysts praised Burkina Faso's courage, framing it as another fracture in Western dominance. State media described the pivot as a lesson in multipolarity. In Beijing, the response was more practical. Ground was broken for 3 new processing facilities, in Shenzhen, Tianjin, and Nanjing, within weeks of the deal. For China, this was not just about butter. It was about anchoring influence in a region where railroads, refineries, and trade routes could reshape the global balance of power. And across Africa, the ripple was undeniable. In Accra, in Addis Ababa, in Dakar, leaders studied the Burkina Faso model. Could cocoa, coffee, or cotton be reimagined under the same principle? Processed at home, traded on equal terms, guarded by sovereignty? The old order had expected silence. Instead, it faced alignment. If butter could bend empires, what might happen when Africa applies the same doctrine to its other treasures? They tried to silence Africa with bombs and debt. But God is greater than their weapons. If you believe God is moving, type, "God bless Africa." What began as a quiet decree in Washington ended as a declaration in Ouagadougou, a tariff meant to humble a small landlocked nation had instead sparked one of the most important lessons in modern trade. Sovereignty is not given, it is built. The United States believed that a 50% tariff would corner Burkina Faso into submission. Instead, it pushed the nation to redefine itself. The women who once cracked Shea nuts in silence now stood as symbols of dignity. The drivers who once slept in idle trucks now carried loads with purpose. The cooperatives that once feared collapse became laboratories of empowerment, logging digital invoices, negotiating contracts, and even learning new languages to defend their work. President Ibrahim Traoré did more than sign a contract. He turned butter into a banner. He transformed an economic weapon into a political doctrine. He reminded his people and the world that Africa does not need to beg for survival. It can choose sovereignty. But this story is larger than Burkina Faso. Across the continent, leaders are asking, if shea butter can be leveraged for power, why not cocoa in Ghana, cotton in Mali, or coffee in Ethiopia? Why not gold, uranium, and oil? If butter can bend empires, what happens when Africa refuses to export its riches raw and instead demands value, processing, and dignity at home? This is the challenge before us. One path leads back to dependency, to the old roads paved by colonial legacy. The other path leads forward, toward sovereignty, rooted in contracts, culture, and courage. The world is watching. Beijing will calculate. Washington will adapt. Markets will shift. But the true decision lies in Africa's hands. Thomas Sankara once declared that Africa must consume what it produces, and produce what it consumes. His voice was silenced decades ago, but today, in the actions of Ibrahim Traoré, that vision has found its echo. The whisper of sovereignty has become a voice. Tomorrow, it could become a chorus. So I ask you, was this Africa's turning point? Or just the first chapter of something greater? Drop your voice in the comments. Write it loud. New Africa. Africa, rise. Africa can do it. Because in the end, this was never only about butter. It was about sovereignty, dignity, and the belief that Africa's time is not tomorrow. It is today. Tonight we are all children of Africa, folks. Don't let silence erase us. Africa speaks, the world must listen. Pray with us. Peace for Africa. Every comment is more than words. It's a handshake of solidarity. Proof that the fight isn't over. And justice hasn't walked away. Africa isn't here to catch up. We're here to build. Brick by brick. System by system. Action by action. On our terms. In our way. Subscribe now for more stories of Africa's courage, leadership, and hope. God bless Africa. Amen.